What's a bigger problem, addiction or poverty in America?
Oh boy.
They're close cousins,
They're,
obviously.
they're such close cousins, so interrelated. I think I would say poverty, because I think poverty is more, they is more a driver of addiction than addiction is a driver of poverty. They certainly both feed each other.
Nick Kristof.
Great to be with you. It's been a while.
I'm so happy you're here. Nick Kristof, New York Times opinion columnist. No, you're not a columnist. You're a columnist.
I am not a columnist. Let me clarify that.
The New York Times columnist. You know, I always have to giggle when I read it says opinion columnist, because you're not actually giving your opinion. You're reporting, and you're reporting the facts, no?
I'm a deep believer in going out and reporting and getting out of the office and kicking tires. And, part of that was that I was a foreign correspondent for decades. And all the time you get so frustrated by seeing these people in New York or Washington pontificating about the world without actually, going out and talking to people.
Being in the world.
Yeah, and likewise, I'm from a small rural town in Oregon, and it always felt like people never actually came out to towns like mine and talked to people. So I believe in reporting.
But why is it called opinion? Just that's the job you got?
I do inflict my opinions on people, but I
Inflict.
but I do really believe that it's helpful not just to spit out opinions, but also to add some facts and some reporting to the pot and before you stir it.
That is definitely the right way to go. So we met last time for your book, Half the Sky, which would have been 14 years ago. So then what happened?
Been reporting a lot all around. We also, my wife Cheryl and I are now based out in Oregon on the family farm that I grew up on. And it's been, I went from covering humanitarian crises abroad to encountering one in my little hometown. And I went to heal, and I found myself really kind of struggling with what the community had been through, a community I totally love. But, at this point, more than a third of the kids on my old school bus are gone from drugs, alcohol, and suicide and reckless acts, deaths of despair. Half the Sky was in part about sexual violence, and it's something I've written a lot about. It was one of the things that was hardest for me to appreciate was the degree to which old friends, 2 boys on my old bus raped very young girls, were sent to prison for that, and trying to understand how that happens, how good people end up not only suffering greatly, but inflicting great suffering on others. And so it's one of the things I've been wrestling with and trying to understand and trying to do my little part to, with Cheryl to try to address. But I think one of the things we learned fundamentally is that hurt is transitive as well as intransitive, that people hurt, but hurt people then hurt others. And that's the story of so much of America.
In your series, How America Heals, you hit head on this issue of poverty and addiction and how those two things, are terrible in themselves. They inform one another, and then they create terrible outcomes. So is it America's fault that this has happened, or is it just life's fault? Poverty exists. These things exist everywhere.
So there's, I think, a big debate in the U.S. about this personal responsibility narrative. And my take is personal responsibility is absolutely a real issue. And people make bad choices, and I've seen that in my friends they would fully acknowledge that they made bad choices. They dropped out of high school, they cooked meth, they robbed stores. But if we're going to have that conversation about personal responsibility, and that's fine to have, we've also got to have a conversation about our collective responsibility. And that means getting kids into pre-K so that they're ready for school. It's make sure that they can read by 3rd grade, make sure they graduate from high school. And I do think that this country has, we have alarming rates of child poverty. We have a conversation in this country about college access, which is great, but we still don't talk much about the fact that 1 in 7 American kids doesn't graduate from high school. And if you don't graduate from high school in 2024, you're cooked. Your kids are cooked. You know, so often I think we fail these kids before they fail us. And I think that's a story of a lot of my old friends.
If you were to take those old friends from your bus and put them into a wealthier community, a coastal city, do you think they would have gone down the same road?
So, look, we measure wealth with dollar amounts, and we measure poverty often by dollar amounts. But I think that in many ways, a better metric of child poverty might be how often you're hugged, how often you're read to, whether there are children's books in the house, whether your mom and dad are beating each other or, shooting each other in some cases. And that was the kind of poverty that was way too common in my area. There was a lot of domestic violence. There was a lot of alcoholism. There was a lot of violence towards the kids. And there were no children's books in the house. Kids weren't read to. It was assumed that they would drop out of high school, and kids lived up to that expectation. I am totally confident that if more of my friends had grown up in homes where they were read to, were supported, did have expectations they would go through high school, were nurtured, that their lives would be quite different. One of my friends, he had a very, very violent dad. His ambition when he was a kid was to murder his dad. That consumed him. And, what does that do to you? Well, he's dead. His daughter then died of alcoholism at 29. It's wrenching to see this in people in a community you love.
Okay, the things you listed, like being read to, like being hugged, being loved, being supported, that has nothing to do with your socioeconomic status, or does it?
It doesn't need to, but it does. It does have quite a bit to do with one's educational status. There are different kind of class approaches to education. And there was one famous study, it's a little bit dated now, but it looked at how many words a child heard by the age of 3. And children of all social classes, they first learn to speak at the same level. There's no innate difference in verbal ability, but by the age of 3, a child of professionals has heard 3 million more words. Is it 3 million or 30 million? 30 million more words than a child that is on social services. And, so that adds up. That means that child of professionals is better prepared for kindergarten or first grade, is going to be just better equipped. And, we can't solve this fully, but we can coach parents to read more to their children. There are some great programs that do a fantastic job of that. Reach Out and Read is one. And, there are other childhood literacy programs for like First Book. And then we can, support them with pre-K and good schools where they're nurtured. In most countries around the world, needy kids get more support, get more spending on their education. In the U.S., it's the opposite. If you are a low-income kid who most needs that help, you're more likely to go to a failing school, and one that is struggling get less support. Whereas if you live in Palo Alto in a $3 million home, then you go to one of the best school systems in the country, even though your parents are also paying for private tutors and everything else.
100%. So you talk so much in your writing about the diseases of despair, the deaths of despair. What are they?
So, deaths of despair is typically thought of as drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And I sometimes add reckless accidents to that because I just have seen in my friends the degree to which people, especially young men, but also young women, just engaged in really risky behaviors, whether it was, the driving while drunk or, or getting into knife fights or just 1,000 things. But these are immense, and I don't think this is a crisis that I don't think we've addressed. I spent a lot of time covering the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I'm glad I did. They were important to cover. But every 2.5 weeks, we'd lose more Americans to drugs, alcohol, and suicide than we lost in 20 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I don't think that politicians, we in the media, the public, have come to terms with how much pain there is in so many homes around the country.
And there's not one place to point and say, it's the fault of this, it's because of this. You can't draw a direct line, can you, between these type of deaths of despair and geography necessarily, or financial security necessarily. It seems like it's a soup.
I think that's right. You can draw a line to two things, though, I think, imperfectly. One is education, that certainly these happen to people with every educational background. They very disproportionately happen to kids who either dropped out of high school or did not get a four-year college degree. Angus Deaton, who really pioneered the work on deaths of despair, the way he puts it is if you have a four-year college degree, you largely are vaccinated against these kind of problems. Not perfectly true, but largely true. And I think the other line one can draw, and I'm curious if you agree or disagree, but it always seems to me that as a country, we have the biggest trouble making policy on things that are hard to talk about. I covered AIDS a lot, and so many people died unnecessarily of AIDS because it was sexually transmitted and often man to man. And that was something we were uncomfortable talking about. Domestic violence, hugely undercovered, because again, it's embarrassing, it's shameful, it's hard to talk about. And I think addiction, suicide are largely the same. And so we don't address these seriously in policy. We don't tend to talk about them in polite conversation.
And we don't support recovery.
And we don't support recovery. Just the number of people who are just desperate for help, and you go and you want to get in a program, and you're told, okay, 3 weeks from now there's an opening over here, and no, you can't take your dog, or whatever it may be.
Right. That's where I stand. I do think there should be greater access to serious support programs for people trying to recover.
Totally.
And
it pays for itself. It's imperfect. Recovery is hard. It doesn't always work. People relapse. But boy, it's better than other things.
100%. You live in this small rural town where lots of people have fallen to the deaths of despair. Do you personally have survivor's guilt?
I think I have it a little bit at a couple of levels. One is that in covering humanitarian crises abroad, I see really talented people all the time. I'm just back from the Chad-Sudan border covering the crisis there, and there were these kids who were starving and who'd been shot and who'd been raped, and there I waltz in and sort of parachute in and report, and then I march back to my life. And I think about the fundamental unfairness of that, and then I think about the kids that I grew up with. I wrote a memoir. I came out with a memoir in May called Chasing Hope, and it forced me to kind of think about some of these kids. And I remember, what I really remember was when we were all growing up together, it was clear that I was a better reader than most, and that they were better at fixing carburetors or picking, like farm work, picking berries. We used to pick berries each summer. And it wasn't clear which skill was going to be more important to success. Many of them were also better athletes than I was, and which was something that mattered too. And so for most of human history, you would have been more successful if you were a more agile berry picker or a better
Yes.
athlete or,
Yes.
or better at fixing carburetors. It just so happened that I hit I won the lottery, and I happened to grow up in an age when reading correlated to success and fixing carburetors did not. And so my friends who, one of my good friends who taught me about fixing carburetors, Billy Beard, he passed away about a year ago.
I loved your piece on him.
Thank you. It was,
Tough to read, tough to
yeah,
experience.
it was, hard to see him dying young and unnecessarily. And he was an example of somebody who both suffered greatly and also inflicted suffering on others.
It goes together.
Totally.
It goes together, and that, for me, is the biggest heartbreak. I work a lot with formerly incarcerated men and women, and I feel like they're victims as well as they have victimized, and thank God I'm not a judge, and I don't have to. Well, actually, to that point, just last week I was called for jury duty.
Oh.
And it was, right, a drug.
If I were the prosecutor, I might move to remove you.
I was pretty sure that's how it was going to go. However, before it could get to that point, I had to raise my hand and say I cannot be objective. And I could not be objective because it was a drug case. And working with that community and also being an addict myself, I know that nothing happens in a vacuum. And I didn't feel I could be objective. I'm interested if you could.
I think I could, in the sense that, look, you're right about the disadvantages that people have faced. I think that the average American who was in a state prison has had 10.5 years of education. They're basically a 10th grade dropout. Again, we failed them before they failed us, and that is one reason they ended up committing these felonies. On the other hand, those folks, when they are not incarcerated, the people whose homes they're breaking into, whom they're assaulting, are other people from that same demographic. And so if we want to protect communities, then we're in this terrible position where we are imprisoning some members of the community, this disadvantaged community, to protect other members of that disadvantaged community. And we can do better with both preventive elements, and that's supporting kids along the way. I mean, there are things like street lighting that turn out to be quite effective at reducing crime, and things that are sort of unrelated, But,
Right.
And we can do better when people are in prison and giving them into job training programs and there are 1,000 things we can do. But could I, in good conscience, convict somebody who has done something wrong? Yeah, I could.
Wow. Not wow, like, how could you? But wow, like, now I'm surprised at myself that I couldn't. I felt I couldn't. But now to hear you put it so clearly, maybe I could.
My friend Billy, whom I just mentioned, so he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for brutally assaulting this young woman. And he, he thought that sentence was a little long, but he didn't dispute the idea that he should have been locked up. And I have another good friend who I've known a long time. He's been using since he was 12. He got almost no education. During the pandemic, he was selling fentanyl out of his car trunk, and he was homeless. He was using and selling fentanyl. And his mom and I were just praying that he was going to get arrested to save his life and to save the lives of others. And I felt terrible wanting him to be arrested. And then about a year ago, he just was fed up. And he walked up to a police officer and said, "You got a bunch of warrants on me." And the police officer kind of reluctantly arrested him. And then at his trial, the public defender was trying to work out a deal to, get him off after a few months. And my friend said, "No, I don't want a deal," and demanded that the judge send him not to the county jail because he said, county jail's full of drugs.
Yeah,
Send
yeah,
me
yeah.
to the state penitentiary. And the
Man.
judge kind of reluctantly said, well, okay, and sent him. And he got clean in the state prison. He went through a series of programs. He was released in February of this year. He's doing so great. And, you know, in that case, it worked out well for him to go. Now, that's not...
It's a crazy moment when you can say thank God for prison, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it's certainly not true broadly, and often it's the opposite, but there are times when a prison can be a kind of a timeout if they get support.
Yes, 100%. So many of the people I work with after they come out say, thank God I got sat down. Thank God I was out of circulation. Saved my life and others. So that's for sure. If you could make such a stark conclusion, and I don't know if you can, what's a bigger problem, addiction or poverty in America?
Oh, boy.
They're close cousins, obviously.
They're such close cousins, so interrelated. I mean, I think I would say poverty, because I think poverty is more, I mean, they is more a driver of addiction than addiction is a driver of poverty. They certainly both feed each other. But I think that people often turn to drugs or alcohol because they're self-medicating. They're self-medicating because of a sense of lack of purpose, a lack of opportunity, a frustration about where they are, about their ability to achieve their hopes, to find a life of meaning. And I think that if we could do a better job giving people that sense of hope and purpose, which means in many ways a better education, then I think that we would have a lot less addiction.
Amen, 100%. I couldn't agree with you more. You go all over the world reporting on terrible, horrible things, but reporting on the human condition in these different countries. Are there any countries that are doing it right when it comes to addiction?
So I think Portugal is a good example, but I think Americans have, while they've looked a lot at Portugal, I think they've misinterpreted what Portugal does. And so if you ask a lot of Americans in drug policy, what did Portugal do? They said, well, they decriminalized hard drugs. And that is true. So, but it's a lot more than that. So essentially Portugal had a big heroin problem. And then I think it was 1999 or maybe 2000, they decriminalized possession of even, heroin or cocaine. You could still be in prison for trafficking in it, but not users. And so I think a lot of Americans took away and that succeeded really well. The number of heroin users dropped by 2/3. Portugal now has the lowest overdose rate in Western Europe.
Wow.
But what really succeeded was not the decriminalization, it was treatment. They went all out to get people into treatment. So there are social workers around the country who go and talk to people, and they have these methadone vans that are going around twice a day and everywhere to support people. And the decriminalization was just an instrument to be able to get social workers to talk to people, to build trust, this kind of thing. But that was very much secondary to the treatment outreach. And so...
Do you see that kind of thing working here?
I think the treatment... So Oregon, my state, we voters passed a measure called Measure 110 that basically it was people thought it was modeled on Portugal, and it decriminalized drug possession, hard drug possession. It was something of a disaster. That was because they rolled out the decriminalization. They didn't roll out the treatment, and the treatment is the heart of it. And the decriminalization is kind of one way of making treatment work a little better, but it is that's, you could still do the treatment without the decrim, And I think that, in America we've tried to focus too much on the interception of drugs, and that's, yeah, we have to do that. That's relevant, but that now with synthetic drugs, that's just so hard. You don't have fields that you can deal with. You just
Right.
have labs, and
Right.
and fentanyl is so much more potent than heroin, and then next you have nitazene coming down the line, which is 10 times more potent than
I don't know what that is.
fentanyl.
I don't know if I want to know. but
It's
what
a
is
next. It's a next synthetic drug, and it's just tiny. It's almost impossible to stop the smuggling. And we can try to interrupt it, but I think fundamentally we have to do a better job on the demand side, which means giving people more reason not to use. And it used to cost $20 to get high in most American cities. Now you can get high for about $2. That's
It's going in the wrong direction.
Yep.
Going in the wrong direction. What impact do you see about the legalization of marijuana on the bigger problem?
I'm not sure. I have strong views about a lot of subjects, but that's one where I think the evidence is a little bit mixed. I'm in favor of marijuana liberalization because I don't think prohibition works, but I am concerned about levels of THC, and I worry about where that leads, and so I'm just not sure.
Yeah. I feel exactly the same. I'm not sure either. Part of me thinks, great, now we can stop a lot of the illegal activity and things can get safer. But then again, kids can pick it up like Starburst. And maybe that's not so good either. Well, on to a brighter topic. And I probably asked you this last time we talked 14 years ago, and I'll ask you again. How do you take care of yourself so you're not just wringing your hands all the time thinking it's all going to hell?
When I was writing this memoir, Chasing Hope, I kind of self-diagnosed myself with a mild case of PTSD.
No kidding, Nick Kristof. If anyone in the world has earned it, it's you.
And then, I never really thought about it, but when I did, yeah. And then I realized that in the same period, I had really taken up backpacking incredibly enthusiastically. My daughter and I hiked the whole Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada. We backpack every summer. I drag my poor wife out in the mountains all the time. And I think that I unconsciously prescribed wilderness therapy for my unprescribed, unconscious PTSD. So I think that's part of it.
You're self-diagnosing, you're self-prescribing, you're a real HMO sitting right there.
But I think also the thing that doesn't always come across is that I have seen a lot of progress, frankly, in my life, and I'm not sure that we in journalism do a good enough job acknowledging that. That when I was a kid, a majority of humans had always been illiterate. Now we're pushing 90% adult literacy. Domestic violence, sexual violence against women, in I think it was 1978, there was a survey in the U.S. that half of Americans said it was sometimes okay for a man to beat his wife with a stick or a belt.
What?
Can you believe it? Half
No.
of Americans.
No, I can't believe that. What are you saying?
Now, now nobody would even ask that question. There have been real strides in the U.S. and abroad, so that every day for decades, about 300,000 people worldwide have moved out of extreme poverty, and I guess the other thing which doesn't always come across is that in my reporting, just side by side with the worst of humanity, you find the very best. And you just find the incredible, heroic people who inspire you about the human capacity for decency and courage in in rural Pakistan, I came across this extraordinary woman named Mukhtar Mai, who had been sentenced by a village council to be gang raped because of something that her younger brother supposedly had done. In fact, he probably didn't. And this village council, then they carried out that sentence. They gang raped Mukhtar. And their expectation was she would then kill herself out of shame. And instead, Mukhtar found it within herself to prosecute her attackers, to send them to prison. And then she used compensation money to start the first school in her village because she thought that education was the best way to chip away at the kind of misogyny and cruelty that she had suffered. And then she enrolled the children of her attackers in her school.
Wow.
And
That's an amazing story.
how can you not be in that village and just not feel pretty good about humanity?
Yeah. Well, like you said, the worst and the best.
Totally.
But the best part is what matters, right?
Yes.
I mean, the best part, the fact that it ends on the best, even
When
if it
people
starts
are
in the worst.
tested in a way that they often are not in this country, but when they are tested in a crisis like that or in Sudan, then some people become sociopaths and murder their neighbors, and others make these extraordinary sacrifices. And that is what I take away and I come back with and I see and I'm so admiring of. I feel better about our species sometimes.
I always think about how easy our lives are in the States compared to other parts of the world. I think we all have our own personal tests, right? That maybe not societal tests like the ones you're describing, but certainly personal ones. What's been your greatest test?
I think it was so I was the Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times in the late 1980s, early 1990s. I covered the Tiananmen democracy movement and the massacre that followed it. There was a young man who had helped my wife and me cover the democracy movement, the massacre, the crackdown. Partly because he had helped us, he was then caught. He was sent to prison, and then he escaped. And he came to Beijing and asked me for help fleeing the country.
Wow.
As you know, one of the pretty basic rules being a foreign correspondent is you don't help but escape, felon, flee the country.
100%.
And I was afraid that if we did that, we would get caught. We could be sent to prison. The New York Times bureau would be closed. We would be betraying our employer, violating every journalistic principle around. And yet here's this 19-year-old kid who would help New York Times readers, help me. I'd won a Pulitzer, partly because of the help that he and others had provided. And if we didn't help him, he at some point was going to get caught. And that wouldn't be pretty. And we couldn't consult editors because our phones were tapped, but also no editor in their right mind can say, obey, just violate the law. And so Cheryl and I just agonized over this, and then we did help him with as few fingerprints as we could find. He got to Hong Kong, and then I flew down to Hong Kong the next day and helped him get to the U.S., and he's now in the U.S. And, it's probably the most unprofessional thing I've ever done, but one that I'm quite proud of.
I can't imagine how you could have lived with you had you not taken that exact course of action.
Yeah, that's fundamentally what happened.
How'd your bosses handle it?
I came clean after he was safe. I came clean, and I wondered if I'd committed a firing offense, but actually, maybe because it was successful and we hadn't been caught by the Chinese, so everybody was actually quite congratulatory. And it turned out that one of our former editors, Abe Rosenthal, in 1959 had smuggled an interpreter out of Poland, for similar reasons, and so my editors were totally congratulatory. I wrote about this in my new memoir, and nobody batted an eye. And so, but if I'd been caught and arrested and the New York Times bureau closed down, one of the things we really worried about at that time was, look, I'd never heard of anybody escaping from a Chinese prison.
Yeah. Yeah, by the
And
way.
that I worried that this was an effort to entrap us and get us in trouble and then kick us out.
Wow.
And I, um, and and I mean, thank God for my wife. I married up. So Cheryl, we talked about it, and she said, she said she thought he was not entrapping us, that this was for real, and just that how can we not help him? How can we
Right.
not?
Yeah, but
And she was
you're right. That really could have gone either way. You took a huge risk.
And if it had gone the other way, I probably would not be
No,
a New York Times
sir.
columnist talking to you right now.
That's exactly right. Wow, that's heavy. That's a really deep thing. But again, even if there was a chance that you were being entrapped, you had to make the moves you made. Not everyone would have, but I think knowing you a bit, reading your columns, I can't imagine you making a different decision.
I mean, I hate to say it, but it was a close call.
Was that
I
close?
can't imagine. I mean, if Cheryl had argued the other way, I think I might not have helped him. I genuinely really struggled over that, and I'm really glad I made the decision I did. But
Yeah.
but
That's a big.
it was a hard one.
Yeah, no kidding. I'm also glad that you made that decision. So finally, we started off this conversation. You said you moved back to your family farm to heal. Was it from what we're discussing, the trauma you've experienced around the world, the things you've seen, or what was the healing you were looking for?
It was from covering too many massacres, too much genocide, too much war, and just the fear that you have when your gut clenches and there are bullets whizzing around, or somebody's holding you at gunpoint and you don't know how it's going to go. And then eventually it unclenches, but it never fully unclenches. And there was just a lot of that in a lot of places, and I spent a lot of my time scared.
Well, I still do, right? You were just, like you said, you were just in Chad and Darfur, and
Yeah, but I mean, there's this notion, I think, somehow that reporters are sometimes addicted to danger. I don't buy that at all. I mean, I'm terrified of it. but when you see these things, when you see people who've been slaughtered or subjected to mass rape or the villages burned, then you want to fight back. And the tool that I have to fight back is not a M4 automatic weapon. It's my laptop and my camera. And the only way to fight back with a laptop and a camera is to go there and report. And so that's where I am.
it's quite a platform, right? It's a very special place you hold in journalism, for the New York Times, no less. Are you ever really afraid for your life going into these places, thinking I might not make it out, and is it worth it?
So I certainly never go down a road. I mean, I owe it to my wife and my kids never to go down a road if I think, oh, I'm not going to make it back. I mean, I always believe that I'm going to, that I'm going to get the story, but I'm also going to get home to tell it. But the problem is that sometimes you think that road is going to be just fine, and then all of a sudden you're at a checkpoint, and there are these drunk kids who are robbing you and holding you at gunpoint, and they could kill you or they could not kill you. You have no control over that outcome. And those 1% risks add up, and at some point your luck can run out. And that's that's the very hard thing that you have to weigh between the importance of covering a story, but also the obligation you have to your loved ones and trying to, I mean, Cheryl thinks that I don't that I'm not very good at weighing those risks. And there's this dynamic in our household where, whenever I go off, I always promise, of course I'll be careful. And then, something goes wrong, and then I sort of, come back, tail between my legs. Yeah, that was a problem. But she forgives me, thank God.
Well, thank God is right, but it's an interesting family you have. I mean, right. I liken it to the wife of a firefighter or the husband of a police officer who goes into really scary pockets of the city and the world every day. And your whole team is very committed to your craft and, like you said, to the obligation you have to tell these stories. It's really something. You don't need me to tell you that, but I think you guys have a real good thing going.
We, I should say that if you think reporters are crazy, the real crazy ones are the photographers and the people with the video cameras, because
I love them.
when there's gunfire ahead, my first rule of covering conflicts, you never get a ride from a photographer, because when they hear gunfire, they hit the accelerator, they want to go for it. So you want them to be in your car, but you don't want them to control the car.
That's really funny. Oh, this is very overwhelming.
We covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, we sure did. Again, I am. There's so much to chew on here and so much to think about, and I can't wait till we speak again. I just
Thank
so
you so
enjoy
much.
talking to you. Thank you for coming.
Great to be with you.
And welcome to the round table at the Algonquin. Pretty cool, huh?
Yeah, journalistic history right here.
Right here. Well, we're making it. That's what's happening here.